So let's get into specifics. I'm going to rattle off some innovations that you came up with or stole
So
uh, that affect.
I'd say
Uh,
popularized is a good one.
great, yes. The imploder lance.
Mm-hmm.
Because of shields, the imploder lance is required, and so combat becomes closer,
Yeah,
which makes it more like, I don't know, 17th century ship combat.
temporarily till they come up with the next innovation.
Indeed.
There is over the course of the books a continuous cycle of new weapon, new defense, new weapon, new defense, which is the way arms race go. Um, so that's kind of like it's a science fictional version, but it's a normal pattern. Um, we have horse cavalry, and then we invent the tank, and then we invent the trench, and then we invent air warfare. Each one trying to deal with whatever the problem was in the last war, and dumping down on the people trying to make war a whole bunch of new things that old tactics are not adapted to. So that's just kind of one example of a procession that just keeps on going. I think the really interesting weapons are the biological ones, which we have not only just barely touched on.
Would you include saltoxin gas in that?
Yeah, that's a gas. I mean, it has biological effects. Um, so yes, it is a made up thing to create the plot result I wanted, but it is not a implausible thing.
It was so powerful because it directly challenges the deepest fears of the Baryaran soul. The
Yeah,
idea that you could wipe out the clean bloodlines.
yeah, it's a
That
terror weapon,
yeah.
as is these other nerve gases in our world. Um, and so talk some. Oh, Fatane was the other one. That was the one in the war game. That was
Oh, okay.
specifically,
Sorry.
yeah. So talks, two different things, but same idea. They damage your kids. I was thinking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the recoil from nuclear weapons, which seemed like a good idea at the time in 1945, when their long-term effects became apparent and people realized that these things attacked their biology, attacked their progeny, even if they survived the radiation. And that in our world, that got people upset and excited. So yeah, barrier, that's just the same thing.
The next one you didn't invent, but which is critical to how fights go and stuff in the book, is
Mm-hmm.
stunners. Was that just your first thought, best thought?
Yeah, it's like it's an improved stunner. It's Star Trek, but it's an idea that's been kicking around. We have tasers now, um, so that's kind of genre furniture at that point. Stunners are a thing that
Yeah.
anybody can pick out of a prop box and use. It has some interesting plot effects. It is usually non-lethal and non-injurious. If you happen to fall off a catwalk just after you were stunned, it's still going to kill you, but it was not the intent. It's a weapon with which you can shoot first and ask questions later. Um, it would allow people to be more trigger happy. If you want to have a fight, if you want to have a street fight, if they've got stunners, they're not going to hesitate to fire. But there are other weapons that have more permanent effects that you have to be much more careful with. Nerve disruptors or plasma arcs that do actual physical damage.
Yeah, I was thinking about this relating to if there were civil unrest, that maybe stunners, they would affect the way that demonstrations would go, for example, because today in our world, it's hard to restrain people without hurting them. And that can be
Yeah.
a way that people use this to demonstrate that they put their bodies, on the line to protest something. So in a way, it's a little bit frightening, the idea of having stunners, because you could, as a police, for example, just stun everyone and then they cannot do their free speech.
Yeah. Let's say well, we have rubber bullets, which is kind of like attempt to do the same thing. You want crowd control without actual having mass murder.
Yeah, but those hurt. So then you kind of win a moral victory.
Stunner isn't fun either. You get a stunner headache. It's an
That's true.
unpleasant experience. It's probably, I have never been either stunned or hit with a rubber bullet, so I don't know how they would compare, but they're neither of them something you would court. So yeah, that's more of your arms race. We have later in the story, we have somebody coming up with a clothing net that's kind of like long underwear made of this protective material that blocks stun and nerve disruptor beams. So there we have attack versus defense, booting up
That's
each
the bait
other.
and tech Victor Rotha is trying to sell at the beginning.
Yeah. So that has been thought about. But it would change how things were done.
Another one that has a huge impact on the plot is Fast Penta.
Ah, yes.
No longer do you have to torture,
Yeah.
put leverage on all this stuff, and you can trust everything the person says.
Well, kind of. You have to be careful with fast penta interrogations because they will only tell you what they think is true. If they are mistaken, they will still be mistaken. Which is why you have to be trained to be a fast penta interrogator. It makes my universe a little bit softer. We can get rid of most torture because first of all, torture doesn't work in our world, and it would certainly not work anybody better in that one. And the other thing it does is allow you to clear yourself. If you are falsely accused, you can testify under fast penta, and they will know that you are telling the truth or what you believe to be the truth. So it would eliminate a whole lot of false accusations, which I think could be very legally important. That is a technology that gets an interesting range of emotional responses from readers. There are some who say, "Oh yeah, it'd be great to be able to clear yourself from a false charge," and others who say, "Oh, it's so invasive, it like violates your personhood." And both of them are right. But which one is important to a particular individual will vary by the individual. Some of them get really upset about fast penta. I'm thinking, compared to what we have now, I think it would be much better.
I get a sense that the Batons would put some regulations on what interrogators, when they're able to use it and so on.
Yes.
Whereas the Baryarns are just like
bringing it by the barrel. It won't hurt anybody.
Yeah, dose the whole town.
Yeah, that came up in not falling free, diplomatic immunity, where they had to go through a whole bunch of legal hoops in order to be allowed to use fast penta to interrogate the character Guppy. And while Miles was waiting around for this, he interrogated him anyway and found out everything he wanted to know. Fast penta without the fast penta. But so yeah, depending on the polity, whether you're Earth or Barrier or Beta Colony or Escobar or wherever, Quadi space, you will have a different set of legal rules about the use of this, and that will tell you something about it'll be a world building thing at that point. How does this polity treat this technology? What do they do with it? How do they regulate it?
Yeah. So how did you decide on the effects of fast penta? Because a lot of times when you have truth drugs, it's going to be people are more, logical or like doesn't show any emotion. They just tell the objective truth. So how come did you decide that it was going to be like people are euphoric and happy?
Yeah. Well, brain. Yeah, it's the way brains work. Yeah, it's like, why would you talk? Why would you tell these things? It's because you don't care. All of a sudden, um, yeah. So why not? This is your best friend. You will tell them everything. So it works on an emotional level as much as anything. Uh, so
The CIA destroyed so many lives trying to construct something like that with they pump people full of acid and all manner of
yeah,
strange chemicals.
yeah. I think we are not there yet, and it's probably just as well. Um, the other thing I read was polygraph tests. I read books and things about the polygraph tests that they've been trying to do. Trying to do the same thing. Can you tell if a person is lying? And the results are horrific. I read one where this guy who had been a polygraph operator for some years and had convicted people on the basis of his scientific thing tried one day to put his polygraph on plants and discovered he got the same readings. And rather than deciding that his polygraph was crap and he'd been, you know, wrongfully convicting people all these years, he decided plants think. And he wrote a book about this. And it's like you could see him defending himself, his moral self that he didn't want to give up. He really didn't want to be that wrong. So better to think that plants think than to think that I did these things. It was a fascinating study, but not the study he thought he was writing.
So many problems in our world come down to that, of people refusing to admit they're wrong.
Mm.
There's a really great Doctor Who special called The Giggle where it's basically becoming an apocalypse because everyone thinks they're right and refuses to use their minds.
Yep.
Plants talking. I don't know if you get into that in your books. It's a little fantastical.
Not even E. Catherine goes that far. Well, the plants do communicate in interesting, weird ways if you've been keeping up with biology research, with all the things that fungus do and chemical communication among plants within ecosystems. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
Speaking of, have you read Semiosis or Interference by Sue Burke?
No.
Okay, there's a thinking plant in that one. It's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of other writers, at a certain point you started going to award shows or conventions, right?
Mm-hmm. I had my first brush with conventions back in the late 60s, early 70s when I was with the science fiction group, and conventions were much smaller then. I went to a few. So when I came back in the mid 80s as an aspiring writer, I knew about conventions and I started going to them again then. So there's a 15-year break, but go ahead.
Oh, I just wondered, separate from interacting with fans and panels and stuff, but you'd also meet a lot of fellow writers.
Yes.
What has that been like? Are they entertaining? Are they annoying, boring?
They're everything and a study in their own right. It was, particularly when I was a newbie writer, amazing to meet the writers that had been the ones I'd read. Poul Anderson. I got to go with Poul Anderson and his wife to visit the museum in Philadelphia at a convention once. Several very memorable hours. Poul Anderson doddering around with hearing aids, just like me now. Um, Wondering whether I read you as a tiny child would be well received or not. So there are writers I admired. There are writers I watched putting their feet in their mouth and don't do this, Lois. The writers, there was a period where I was trying to get every writer to tell me about their home office because I had no home office. I was sort of like living in the interstices of my family in this very small house in Marion, Ohio. And it was like, dream. Oh, you have a window you can look out. You have a door you can close. It's so amazing. When will I ever get that? Which I eventually did, but took some drastic measures.
Would you send your kids to a friend's house or?
I had various ways of doing it. I would write when they were taking naps, and then they stopped taking naps. Once they both started school, I would write during school hours. But during that stretch between the end of naps and the start of school, I would sometimes hire a babysitter and take my notebook, three-ring notebook and pencil to the public library and write my first drafts there. And come home and type them up in the middle of my dining room chaos. So it worked around. And then my spouse was he had been a chef, and so he was on shift work often. So we had to like dodge around each other to find time. It worked pretty well in the 70s when he was working mostly evenings, and I took evening shift at the hospital. So our schedules matched then fairly well. But after kids and whatnot, it became more of a ad hoc catch as catch can, fit it in where I can.
Did that make writing hard?
Yes.
Like I have to write on my breaks at work, so
okay. Well, that's people have done that. People write where they can, when they can. Yeah. And the more constrained your time, the more dedicated you tend to be to make good use of it. And now that I have all the time in the world, I'm not doing anything. It's very sad. I wish I could send all this free time back to my 1980s and 1990s self. Here's 4 hours. I'm not doing anything with it. You need it, but I can't do that. So you learn to fit it in where you can. I still, when I write, do most of my writings in the morning because that was when the kids went off to school and I had that block of time. So that lingers, even though the kids are in their 40s now.
You mentioned meeting writers that you admired at these events. Did you ever meet Harlan Ellison?
Yeah, a couple of times.
I hear he was a little cranky, but fun to talk to.
Oh, he was he was a thing. He sort of had two different. Somebody described him as having sort of two different brains. There was aggressive Harlan and there was nice Harlan, and you never knew quite which one you were going to get. I remember being in a green room at the same time he was at a convention somewhere, and some young man from the local college had come in to interview him, and had come completely unprepared, and was trying to do just talk about what you want. And what Harlan did instead was start interviewing the kid with all the standard questions. And I was over on the next table, sort of laughing into my slate. Oh, this is so cruel. But so yeah, come prepared. I learned that lesson vicariously just by listening. And the kid was pretty discombobulated, but there it was. So yeah, don't get wrong side two to Harlan. Another lesson that I didn't have to learn myself. But yeah, he was a little nuts. But,
any other writers that you admired that you were excited to meet and it went well?
Oh, yeah. Well, that didn't go badly. It wasn't me having a hard time. Lots of them over time. There are writers that were sort of my peers at the time that have become friends. People like Joe Walton, correspond with nowadays.
I was going to ask a question about Joe Walton because, in among others, she talks about joining a science fiction club at the library.
Yeah, she and I are not that far off in age, so we kind of went through this system at similar points. She's a little younger than me, but British, of course, so that was a different context as well. Sylvia Kelso does writing. She's actually a PhD in English, and she's one of my test readers. Pat and Lillian are still with me. So yeah, and new writers come up and surprise me by saying, "Oh, I read you as a tiny child." Oh, thank you. So that's been a new thing. I've always looked at the writers ahead of me because I was chasing them, wanting to get what they had, and I never really looked over my shoulder much. And
any that you met early in their career that became massive? I'm thinking N.K. Jemisin, someone like that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there was Joe Walton I mentioned. Yeah. Nothing springs to mind, but there have been encounters that I don't remember that they do, because there are hundreds of them. So I may have had effects that I did not perceive.
With respect to awards or conventions, I feel like I read somewhere that you hosted one or more. Is that right? Or that you master of ceremonies or something?
I think I did that once or twice. It was not a job I am comfortable with. I do not enjoy public speaking. Master of ceremonies requires somebody who's really good at public speaking.
Yeah.
And me, I write my speeches and read them because my brain goes blank up there.
Gotcha.
So yeah, not bad. There's a couple on my resume somewhere, but that's not something I pursued as soon as I realized I could avoid it.
Yeah, I remember reading a interview with you when you talked about the promotion of your work, and you said like, "Oh, I just felt like I had to do it, because the book was my tiny child that was drowning, and I had to save it, but
yes.
I didn't want to jump into the water."
It's like jumping into a raging torrent when I really can't swim very well. So yeah, one of the advantages of being semi-retired is that I only do as much promotion as I feel like, and then I can stop because nobody else is relying on me. When a publisher has bet money and time and a book slot on you, you owe that publisher as much support as you can give, because that's fair. But I'm not a writer who's good at that. Now, Mary Robinette Kowal is terrific at it because she has acting experience. She was great. She did a terrific job in 2020, which was the Nebula weekend, when I was to be awarded the Grand Master. We, of course, had COVID. And within a couple of months, they had to pull together the SIFO Nebula weekend from the standard convention at a hotel in California that they were going to do to the very first online version. And they were sort of madly making it up as they went along. And Mary Robinette Kowal, SIFO was so lucky to have her as president that year because she pulled this thing together, and it was a wonderful experience. And I didn't have to get on an airplane. It was like the best of both worlds.
That's awesome.
But she had that background. She knew the computers and the systems and the acting and how to present and all that sort of thing.
I think I've read one of her books. Could you rattle off one or two that you?
Let's see. Mary Robinette Kowal. I've read some of her books too, and I can picture the cover and I can picture the subject matter.
Is it the Calculating
the title is
Stars?
Eluding me. If you look up Mary Robinette Kowal, you'll find them.
The Lady Astronauts.
Yeah.
The Lady Astronauts. It was before that. She was doing Regency Fantasy.
Shades of Milk and Honey.
Incredible. Yeah,
Incredible.
that's the one. Yep, that one.
A woman studying to be a magician in sort of Regency England.
England, yeah. Which is now a whole trope of its own.
That's wild, to create a trope.
I think the first one was Carolyn Stevener and Pat Reedy's Sorcery and Cecilia, which was written back in the 80s. So that sort of kicked off that subgenre.
Was that your friend, Pat Reedy?
Yeah, Pat Reedy, yeah.
Oh. What's that called again?
Sorcery and Cecilia, which is still available as an ebook. And they wrote 2 sequels. And it's out there. You can still get it. And it's a lot of fun.
That's
if
great.
You know your Georgette Heyer or other Regency romances, it's got that, so you get that genre blending experience.
Oh, man. Let's see. Another question. Do you have anything, Sophia?
I was thinking about in regards to the conventions, and I guess this is a pretty broad question, but do you feel like readers' interaction have changed over the years? Like, not in the sense that, of course, the interaction can be different when it can be online and such, but do you think in regards to, for example, what questions they ask or what kind of comments they have, do you feel like there's any difference from?
Quantity has a quality all its own, as they say. In the beginning, I had no feedback, And then there was that period where the only feedback was going to conventions and talking to people face to face. And then the internet happened, and that changed everything. The amount has become very large. You get 1 or 2 reviews a year back in the 80s, and now you could go on Amazon and read reviews all day long. So there's certainly more of it and a wider range, because what people will say in a review, anonymously, is different from what they will say face to face when it's more filtered. So I think I get a more accurate sense of the breadth of reader response now because of the much larger pool and the reduction in social filters that happens. But you have to understand that as you're going in. And that old line that Fred Pohl told me back in the 80s, never respond to a review, never write back to a reviewer, is still good advice. And I'm glad I took it over the years. But yeah, there's way more of it. What the amount has allowed me to do is realize that there are categories. You can, instead of every response being the only one you'll ever get and you have to pay attention to it, you realize that reader response falls into categories. Oh, that's somebody having that problem, and that's somebody who liked this particular thing, and that's somebody who missed this particular thing. And when there's lots of them and not one of them, you realize it's them and not you. We get back to the workshop burn problem. So it becomes easier to process as it grows, because you can categorize.
What kind of categories are there of these? Is it specific? Do you have specifics?
Yeah, somebody will have a trigger about some element in the story and go off quite unhappily about that. Somebody will have, this is an example of somebody who was expecting a different story and didn't get the one they expected, and so now they're complaining because it wasn't the book in their head. There's a lot of that. Of course, each one will have a different book in their head. So that, okay, that's that kind of reader. There's the inattentive reader. Oh yeah, they missed this turn. I can't help it. I put those words on the page for a reason. If you don't read them, I can't help. And there's all kinds of, and then there's ones who pull more out of it than I thought I put in. It's oh, cool. I'm glad that that's working for you so well. But that's because of what you brought to it. You brought this depth, knowledge, and information and character to it, and so that's the book you make up in your head. It can be even better than what the writer intended.
The death of the author kind of thing.
Kind of. I don't know. I'm still alive. I'm right here on the internet. You can come talk to me. Oh, that's the thing. Yeah. People will make up speculations about the writing process or what was going on or what was in my head or what I was thinking. And it's some of it is so far off. And it's I'm right here on the internet. You can come ask me. If you look up Bujold Goodreads blog, you'll find my blog. If you look up Bujold Goodreads Ask the Author, that will be my Ask the Author column, which is part of the Goodreads blog. And you don't have to make stuff up. You can ask yourselves and come find out. And and the thing about making stuff up is somebody will make something up and then somebody else will quote it and somebody else will quote them. And 2 iterations down the line, it's being quoted as fact or as something I said, which I never said. Nobody comes back to check.
What is the most common misconception?
I'm right here on the internet. You can check. The most common one, which keeps being independently reinvented over and over, which was Shards of Honor started as a Star Trek fan fiction novel, which I took the serial numbers off of, which it did not. I have written about that, on my blog and elsewhere. And I have, re-explained that no, that was not the case. And people will still, in completely separate conversations, totally unrelated, generate this idea. And off it's running again. So this is the story they want to be true, I have concluded.
I
mean,
also
who's the
saw that
Spock
one.
and who's the Uhura in this situation?
Yeah, it's like they keep, yeah.
It's hard to map anyone
Oh,
onto
that's the other
Errol and
thing.
Cordelia.
Other thing readers do, they will see some resonance or some bit of inspiration in a story and decide that the story must be a one-to-one representation of whatever the inspiration was, and then start critiquing the story for where it differs from what historical event or whatever they're looking at. Oh, she got this wrong because in real 15th century Spain this happened. It's like, oh, this is a fantasy novel. It has nothing to do with that.
Yeah, that's the whole point of making fictional, so that you can diverge.
Academics whom you would think would be more careful are just as bad as anyone else. They will come up with ideas for things that must have been my inspiration, that is something I've never heard of. And they will go off, to write this long essay about this thing that, it's like, no. Yeah, but it sounds very plausible because they're good writers. They're academics.
Like an author fan fiction.
Yeah, whatever.
Or history.
So
yeah, this is a common thing in academia. I studied criticism in school, and it's just they have to publish. So they have to come up with something. So they grab two things and say they're related, and boom, you've got a bunch of nonsense.
Yeah, if the author is actually dead, there's an excuse for it, but I'm still alive. You can come ask.
Hell yeah.
So, there's no excuse for this. But it's very common, and it predates the internet. And I think it's just a human thing that people do.
Do you ever get requests to like settle arguments? Like two people have different interpretations, and they say like, "Okay, tell us which one is right."
Yeah, which is correct. Yeah, I get those from time to time, and usually I can settle them. Every once in a while, someone will go off with their pet theory and not give it up. She must be wrong. Yeah. So, okay, it's your reading. That's the thing about it. You write these words in a row. They're all the same words in the row for everybody, but each reader takes them in and builds up in their head the mental movie, the mental picture out of the other stuff that's in their head that the writer knows nothing about. So every reader is making up a different reading, a different book from the same text every time anyone reads. Some of them may be more congruent than others, but no two will ever be identical. I will hope that they are, close to what I had in mind, but I can't control it.
It's similar to how each of us is a different person in the eyes of whoever we meet.
Mm-hmm.
Each book is different based on each person.
And the same book will be read at different times in a person's life. A reread will be different from a first read. I mean, this is common. This is normal.
Yeah, and especially with your books where you have so much exploring of characters, so that when you come back to it, you know more about the characters than at the first time, at least on where they're going.
Yeah, so things you made up may get corrected in later books, and then you go back with the corrected version. Oh, that's what she was after. So.
I find that a lot when I reread Shards of Honor as I get older. I'm like, ooh, I'm starting to get what it's like to be 40 and single and like, am I irrelevant? Like, all that stuff. And then hopefully I find my Errol or whatever,
Yeah. But that is how readers read. It's fascinating. They do so much work for me.
Are you interested in adapting your novels to the screen? And if so, have you had any interesting offers?
I am not a movie maker. It's a completely different discipline. I would be very bad at it. So it would take somebody else wanting to do it, and it will take somebody else to do it with $100 million, and that's the sticker. $100 million of somebody else's money is not something any competent director, producer is going to blow on experiments. So they have to be assured they're going to make other people's money back, or they're going to be in trouble. So that, I think, constrains movie and television as it now exists. Now, it's possible that technologies will bring the prices down, and then they can put out more quirkier stuff that doesn't have to have such a large mass audience. And maybe it will happen then. But yeah, if anything of mine were bought now for television, or it really doesn't fit movies, it would be better in a television series. They would have to change it into what's going to make money for them, and it would no longer be my book. So yeah, about that.
Yeah, Stephen King talks about that with The Shining.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, every writer has had something adapted. So it's like, yeah, and they have to deal with, they too have to deal with the materials they have. So it's not something I'm interested in getting into in any way. I would like sign off the license and that would be it. I'm not a scripter. That's a different discipline. I do not want to write my own movie scripts. I would not be competent to mix in with the creative process. So there's all those aspects. I was thinking about manga versus anime. There are vastly more manga written than anime made. They just filter up, the ones that are the best are the ones they think they can make money with, or seem most popular at the time. But the tremendous variety of manga is because it's relatively cheap to produce. The tremendous variety of books is because it's relatively cheap to produce, cheaper now than ever. So it creates a greater range than what filters through to these more expensive media, and it's the money is the barrier.
Have you ever written for a comic, anything like that?
No, that is not a type of writing that I have taken in. So it's not something that I can put out. I would have to have assimilated it by having read a bazillion of them, and then it would come naturally. But I haven't.
I could just see the most amazing comic run in your world, whether the actual stories are inspired. There's so much lore. There's so many characters.
Once again, it would take an adapter who is fluid in that medium to make the transfer over, because they have different structures. There was one comic adaptation started to be The Warrior's Apprentice, a company called Soleil in France. They were going to do a French version of The Warrior's Apprentice in 3 volumes of comic. And they got the first one and it didn't sell, and they dropped the other 2, and that was as far as it went. So there was that one comic. It was very strange. It was very French.
That could be said about a great many things.
But yeah, nothing since then.
Different medium made me think about the role-playing game. I have never played it, but have you played it, Lois?
I had 1 or 2 encounters with it when my kids were young. I sat in on a couple, but I've never played them myself. Role-playing games came along after I became a grown-up and was, working and having kids and trying to boot up my career. So I kind of generationally missed that whole now medium of storytelling. I have friends who were involved. Pat Reedy was a game master for a group in Minneapolis for a long time, and so she can think that way, and I don't.
Sophia, is there a role-playing game based in worlds?
Yeah, Vorkosigan role-playing game. At least I have never played it, but I know that sometimes people mention, the game description of the role-playing game.
Yeah. Way back, once again, I think it's in the 90s and early 2000s, Steve Jackson Games did a GURPS book, GURPS Vorkosigan. And I think you can still get it as an ebook. They may still have a few paper ones left in their
Steve
warehouse.
Jackson Steve Jackson put up my first role-playing game I ever played, Car Wars.
Aha.
He did Illuminati, which hilarious game.
Mm-hmm.
The way it's got these cards, you put them in these hierarchies. So theoretically, you could have the PTA in charge of the mafia. Anyway, that was a lot of fun. I haven't played GURPS in forever.
Vorkosigan exists, and you can find it online, I think, still.
Well, I have a couple actual play shows, so I'm going to spring that one on them. That's fantastic.
Yeah. I was wondering, could we take a short break?
Yes. Welcome back. We wanted to circle back a little bit into process. Sophia, do you want to ask that question? I numbered it number 5, I think, unless the numbers are rejiggered.
I think the one that you mean is talking about continuity, right? So it's like, how do you remember details like tech that might fit the needs of the current situation or things that come up later books?
How do we keep the continuity going across decades of time? Well, anything that is written in the books I can look up and reread and remind myself that way. And anything that is not written I can change. So either I've got it all written down, I may have to hunt for it, or I can do something different. And I've also found it useful to hit my chat list. Does anybody remember the name of that guy? And somebody will have read it more recently than I. Come up with it. So
that's an invaluable resource.
Yeah, continuity kind of takes care of itself. I reread my books so many times in the course of writing them. Certainly if it is a recent book, I will remember it pretty well. Longer ago books are beginning to fade. I was rereading some of my old books earlier this year, and it's like they were written by somebody else, which is true. In a sense, I'm not the same person I was at age 34. So yeah, it isn't that big a deal. I've never found continuity hard to track.
I mostly ask because I have so many weird little details in my books, and I'm bad at remembering all the tech that I introduced. I like in this book that you brought out the tangle field that just destroyed Miles. He has no defense against it. And I wondered if in later books you bring it back. I couldn't remember because it's a pretty useful bit of kit.
Well, if I needed it, it would probably pop out, out of the bag. Yeah. For the last decade, I've been writing medieval fantasy, so tangle fields have not come up. It's another way to deal with continuity. Abandon that universe, go on to another one, start fresh.
Do you ever get any ideas or bring anything over between your universes, like that inspires you to write in another one?
I don't. The universes are so different, which is why I bother writing them. I don't really. There's certain underlying themes that always interest me. The biology of things, how people think.
With the fantasy series, is this like Paladin of Souls, that kind of?
The fantasy series is, excuse me, The Curse of Chalian, Paladin of Souls, which is its direct sequel, and The Hallowed Hunt, which is in the same world but takes place in a different country and time, so there's no character connection. And the now 13 Penric and Desdemona stories, which also take place in what we call the world of the five gods. Now, we started calling it the world of Chalian, and then it grew and became far more than that one country. So we gave it a broader series name.
I'm not familiar with it. I have Paladin, but I haven't gotten very far. I should obviously start with Curse of Chalian.
You probably should. Paladin can be read as a standalone, but it will have spoilers for Chalian. So I think you will get a better read of Chalian if you read it first. And then, that introduces the world. It was where I was making the world up in the first place. And so I think the world building will be easier to assimilate if you read Chalian first. Although the Penric stories are pretty good as standalones. You could just start with Penric's Demon and jump right in, and you would figure it out as you went along eventually.
Sophia, have you read these?
Yeah, I've read those two, but I have not read the Penric story. So I'm actually planning reading that next.
Good.
Cool. I I started with fantasy and mythology. Science fiction only recently came in, whereas it seems like you went the other way. Was it a difficult transition to shift
Well,
over to fantasy?
I've been reading both from my teens, so I never felt that they were, that separate as genres. A lot of the writers I read wrote both. They were kind of ambidextrous. Uh, so I've never felt that separation. I will read either, and with equal pleasure. So yeah, it's all one to me. It's story.
Yeah, you talked earlier in interviews I saw about people having this separation that they're like, oh, I only read the sci-fi or only the fantasy. So I imagine it can be like that with some of your readers, that they just like have only read part of your work.
Yeah, with a broad enough range, I hope to catch enough readers to keep me in beans, which seems to have happened. So not everybody has to like every story. As long as they like some of them, we're good. It'd be
Yeah.
nice if they liked every story, but don't ask for it.
But you've written a lot of series. Like, is that something that you always wanted to do, or did it just happen that you worked in the same universe?
It's got a business side and a creative side. I certainly read a lot of series as a youngster. I mean, I assimilated the idea of series coming up. I read all the Sherlock Holmes stories. I read all the Horatio Hornblower stories. So I kind of knew how series structures could work. Lord of the Rings is not a series; it's one book and divided up. I read that, of course, also. Those are 3 series models. Mystery series, of course, are a thing that I've read all my life. And there were series in science fiction magazines where you would get a story every once in a while with the same characters. James H. Schmitz wrote a lot of those. It tells the Amerden stories and the others. And it was always like, oh, great, there's another Tilsey story. Yay! Yeah. It would come as a surprise. And let's see, Cordwainer Smith is a really great writer from the 60s, roughly. And he wrote very separate stories, but they were all set in the same universe. The Worlds of the Instrumentality was the name of that one. So that was another series model. So I had all these series models in my head. When I sat down to write, it was just to get through my first novel. That was all I could handle in my situation. And then what to write next? Well, The Warriors Apprentice flowed out of Shards of Honor pretty directly. It was like 17 years after. Let's see what happens. Ethan of Athos was the 3rd book I wrote, and it was an attempt to write a more science fictional story that was in the same universe, but it was not necessarily related. So in case one sold, and the other didn't, they wouldn't all sink together. They're like separate lifeboats for my potential career. And then with Falling Free, we had, that was then with Bain, and talked with Jim Batum. I was originally going to make it Miles World story following Artie Mayhew, but we had this long conversation. I ended up with the Quaddies and ended up going back to their start. And so Falling Free became in the universe, but separate, in sort of the same way Ethan of Athos is. And then we got onto Vorkosigan books thereafter. But if you have ideas, the thing about science fiction is that anything set in the same world is by definition part of a series. So it has that series cross-selling power, which I have frequently joked makes mainstream fiction the world's largest shared universe series. It's all set in the same world, it must be.
Oh, like literary fiction
Yeah,
and
literary
romance
fiction.
and
It's
so on.
all in the same universe. Obviously, it's a shared world anthology. And that's a joke, but that thought makes me think about series in a way that frees me up. It's like you've got this series framework in that it's all set in this world. You can write anything in it. You're not limited to whatever type of story you started with. Part of the fun of the Vorkosigan series was to see how many genres I could fit into one series. Whereas normally they're kept very carefully separate. The peas must not touch the mashed potatoes. So that was an ongoing thing that kept me amused through the 80s and 90s. Let's write a mystery next. Let's write a romantic comedy. Let's write a thriller. Let's do all these things because it's a world. You can have everything in it. Why be limited?
Yeah, I think that was one of the selling points when I first heard about the series, was this, that it's so varied in so many different genres and different types of stories in the same series.
It takes readers aback who have trained up on series being, sort of cookie cutter. Every book will be the same as the other in some way, and it will be nothing unexpected. It's like, wait, no, where'd she go? She jumped. So it defies series stereotypes. Go ahead.
Oh, a Star Trek podcaster I like, says that Star Trek is a place. And so you can tell all manner of stories within that place. And you really do that. Another writer that I found fascinating was C.J. Cherry. And she could do sci-fi in one book and somehow make it a part of the same fantasy world with the Gate of Ivral, which I found just remarkable. I guess Stephen King did that with The Dark Tower too, like just mashing two genres that never the twain shall meet.
Yeah, you get a lot of juice that way. You don't have to color between the lines. There are no genre police who will come and take you away for having thrown one element into your story that doesn't normally go there. When I figured that out, it was very freeing. Nobody can stop me.
When was that you figured out?
Probably in the 80s somewhere, pretty early on.
Yeah. One question one type of suggestion for question that I got when I asked other readers for suggestions for this interview was the general, it was like questions. Would you ever consider writing this story of this character at this point in their lives? Like all these different variations of that.
Yeah,
and
I get half my fan mail is that.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You finish the sentence though.
No. That's what I wanted to hear about, is that I guess I'm not going to ask all of those, but I was thinking, do you have like a favorite, like that you remember, like someone wanted, I don't know, some specific one, or maybe you had some ideas that you later didn't end up doing, it could be interesting to hear.
Yeah. If too many readers come up with the same idea, I realize it's too common, too stereotype, too expectable, and I should really do something else that they don't expect. So, too much love can kill an idea.
What kind
everybody has their favorite character that they want more of. Are you going to write another whatever, X? And they always ask for more of what they saw and liked, but by the nature of the question, they can't ask for something they haven't seen.
Yes.
No reader can ask for something completely new, and so they don't generally. So if I want to do something new, I have to give it to myself. I don't have to wait for permission or for somebody to ask. It's like, yeah, we'll do this for me. Because otherwise, if you paid attention to that, you would do nothing but writing your own fractal sequels forever, which is another way to make a living. It's perfectly fine.
It's called The Rise of Skywalker. I'm sorry, I shouldn't.
It's plenty of series have made plenty of money doing just exactly that. But I only have one life to live, and I have limited writing time. So I'd rather not get sucked down into these little whirlpools. Unless there's something about it that speaks to me in some special way. Oh, I want to do that. Lots and lots of people asking me for an Ivan book, and I was like, all the way until the idea I finally had for an Ivan book. It's like, oh, I could do this, and that amused me. And thus you got an Ivan book. It was what everybody was asking for. It wasn't what anyone was asking for, and it was a lot of fun. So it's like,
which one was that?
Captain Vorpatrol's Alliance.
Ah, yes.
with the Ivan book. So it's like the key I draw. Yeah, the ideas just lay there. Yeah, an Ivan book. Yeah, you could do something with Ivan, and then the key idea dropped in. And it's like, oh, it sort of all jumped up around it. We can do this. Give him a. It was thought about for a while, giving a Seed Again girl or some other girl, off-world girl. And I realized that I could have a Seed Again and Jackson's whole cross and give him the worst of both worlds. That got interesting all of a sudden. It was like I didn't need one idea. I needed two to get that going.
What are some ideas that like the fans killed, by making them seem too obvious? Do you remember any?
There have been. They've sort of gone into the compost and turned back to their constituent elements by now. More Dendari stories, this and that. There have been a lot of them over the years. It is a very common kind of request, but I can't think of a specific one offhand.
I'm just fascinated, since I read all of these books when they were already out, so I wasn't really part of any discussion about them. So it's interesting to imagine, because for me I read most of the books very straightforward, so I didn't really have a lot of expectations. But I know that I had with other series, I've definitely sometimes ruined things with my expectations, because it's like you read something and or watch something and then you're just like, oh, I see where this is going. So it's funny for me to imagine all of the Vorkosigan fans or fans of your other books just being like, oh, I have this these things.
Yeah, this expectation of how it will go, and most of them will be disappointed because I'll be doing something else, and I will be only doing something else because I can only write one book at a time, and there are hundreds of them, so most of them will be disappointed. Yeah.
Sophia, are there any suggestions that were completely out of left field and bananas? Because I have one.
No, I think there were things that I had seen before, like from other fans. What was it? One of yours, or was it something that you read?
Yeah, no, I just thought of it 5 minutes ago.
Oh yeah. You should make.
I've always kind of wanted a more realistic, because there are cartoons like this, but a sci-fi hospital, and you have a character who's a doctor who is so idiosyncratic that I could see a story set in a hospital. The one that was super excited about the replicators. Do you remember that guy?
Remember he was, yeah.
Yeah.
Farrier and doctor back there in charge of honor. Yeah.
I can just see him.
Unsurprisingly,
getting up to
a lot of
business.
medical stuff that comes along in the background of my stories, because that's where my life experience lies. So I pull from that whenever I need it. Penrick, interestingly, is a retired doctor at one point in his career. So if you read about him, you'll hit a lot of those issues and me exploring them. I do not actually explore his medical training and career, brief as it was. I jump over it because I can do that with novellas, but it gets mentioned in the backstory wraps. So yeah.
Oh, on this point, there, you wrote in an introduction or a foreword or something that went with Gentleman Joy and the Red Queen. Is that right?
Gentleman Joel, Red Queen. Yep.
Joel, yeah. Something about how, like, you were like, if you're looking for the classic adventure tale, this is something different.
Yep.
I thought that was interesting. Did you write that because you thought it would be necessary ahead of time, or was it as a result of something?
I wrote that because it was the story I wanted to tell.
Oh, no, I just meant the intro where you were like...
Oh, yeah. Most of my intros in the Baen editions were written at Baen's invitation. Will you write a 1,000-word intro for this? I can come up with 1,000 words. Sure. So yeah, there's introductions, there's afterwards, there's discussions. So I've done a lot of like essays for Baen on the books being presented. But yeah, what I was after with Gentleman Joel and the Red Queen was not another Miles adventure or even a Cordelia adventure. What I wanted to write was a study of grief and recovery. And I also wanted to explore what I've dubbed more fun with uterine replicators, more kinds of ways this technology could be used in people's lives that hadn't been explored in depth in the other stories. So I combined those two, and then I had critical mass for the story.
That was the bit of tech I didn't bring up in our tech chat.
Yeah, it's pretty fundamental.
The way you talked about how technology can drive progress, like it would transform the patriarchy.
Oh, yeah.
In a way. Women would no longer be risking death to have children.
Yeah, it would be a great technology if you could have it. And you could. It is not, it doesn't require new physics. It is an engineering problem which could be solved eventually. It's not an easy one. It's tricky, but it could be done. So yeah, this is a technology that may well be coming. My wormhole technology is all bogus, but the biology within the Vorkosigan series is pretty solid. So yeah, as a technology, it puts women in the same position that men have always been in. So male science fiction writers tend to gloss over it because it doesn't make any difference to them. But women kind of sit up and take notice. There are those who would be all for it, and there are those who feel that it would take away something that makes them essential and valuable. So that it gets a bifurcated response from readers.
Yeah,
I would be all for it.
We will end up with all of the planets being like Athos planets. Oh no!
So and it's as a technology, as I've discussed in other interviews, I first read about it in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, where he was using it as a metaphor for the British class system, and he was only looking at one way it could be used. And I have long thought that given this technology, what would people do with it? And the answer is everything. So let's, in the course of this series, try to explore as much of that everything as I can think of for different ways to use this technology, ways it would make a difference, its sociological knock-on effects. Let's get it all in.
Yeah, I think my favorite is the guy who ends up having all these daughters, like in the replicator.
Oh yeah, it's like people have been trying that the old-fashioned way. There's some Japanese guy who got yanked pretty recently, who was like trying to hire as many surrogate mothers as possible to have his kids, and that kicked off some legislation also. But that was after I wrote what I wrote.
I could see what you said about it puts women on equal footing with men. Men traditionally, it's frowned upon, but they could just walk away. And we have a character in The Warrior's Apprentice, or is it? Oh, maybe it's Shards of Honor, who does not want the child and washes her hands of it.
Sent it off in a uterine replicator. There's 17 of those. It's a whole grim story, but yeah. And then there's Ellie Quinn, who donates an ovary to Athos. She is the most reproductively successful female in the Vorkosiverse, and she never has a child. It's all taken care of by the guys. But the thing about discussions of the uterine replicator that I've read outside of science fiction, or of related speculative technologies, is that everybody seems to forget that what you get at the end is not a grown person, but a baby who requires all the 24/7 care to keep it alive as any other baby. And so women would not be ducking out of very darn much. Only the first 9 months out of 18 years. There's a lot more to it.
Yeah.
So there's that.
I can see how it could help with teens and with anyone that should not have been impregnated, but who also is pro-life or anti-choice, depending on your philosophy.
Anti-choice, yeah.
They could make a less awful choice.
Yeah, except it would still, as somebody put it, a placenta is not a Post-it note. It isn't something you can easily pop out of one place and stick into another. Biology does not work that way. the 1,000 years in the future, Vorkosiverse technology, we have, these problems have been solved, but they certainly would not be solved, in the beginning in our time. So yeah, that the way to use a uterine replicator is to start the kid as as an IVF and begin in the root replicator and then go on. That is the proper way to do it. Cordelia's situation was definitely an emergency situation. It was like not the norm, not what anybody sensible would do.
Yeah.
So, the surgery would be better in their time, but it certainly wouldn't be in our times. There's that.
It is very interesting, the idea how so many different responses could be for this technology. Because in Sweden, we generally don't do adoption of like Swedish children because unless it's like absolutely necessary, because the idea is that the child has the right to their biological parents, that it's that the child has it's a specific kind of right for them to have access to the biological parents. So that would be very interesting if you had replicator. Maybe then it would be like it would still be that it was the child's right to the genes that got them into this replicator.
The thing about replicator births is that they're never accidental. Somebody has to contract, somebody, biological work has to be done, somebody has to be paid for it. So there would be legal nets built in. It wouldn't be something you could. There is no such thing as an unplanned replicator birth. So it would have, all the legal safety nets, built in around it. Rules for what you can do, rules for who belongs to what, rules for what happens if somebody dies, all of these things. The legal system would have to take all this on, much to the surprise sometimes of the legal system, but that's what technology does. It requires you to make new laws.
This brings up the situation at Jackson's Hole, where laws don't seem to exist, and you get all this freaky genetic engineering.
Yeah, if you got money, you can do anything you want until somebody stops you. Yeah.
In Star Trek and my own books, they just outlawed genetic engineering because it's like multiversal stories. It can be anything, right? You could have wings or 6 eyes or, how did you decide like where to put that limit, that people can be long-lived and smart and attractive, but you don't have them like, well, I guess the Quaddies is the best
and the Cetagandans. The whole Cetagandan hot culture is a society-wide effort to create the post-human, and that's what's going on with Cetaganda. So yeah, they're in it. But because the Vorkosiverse has many separate polities, many separate planets with separate governments, separate laws, what you are allowed to try depends on where you are. If you want wings on Jackson's Hole, you can get them. If you want to make an Guppy, the merman, the aquatic man, that he was a Jackson's Hole construct, by contract, saying somebody ordered him to be made, and his now gone crush mates. So and then we have all of Ivan Vorpatrol's in-laws. They're multicolored hues, who are also highly genetically engineered. I have mentioned but not done anything with the idea of heavy worlders, people who are genetically engineered to live in gravities higher than what is healthy for normal humans. We, of course, have the Quaddies. My idea for the Vorkosiverse, long term, which I'm not going to be living to write, is that 10,000 years down the timeline, all the aliens will be us, and they will all have been descended from, all the genetic experiments, that failed to fail in this, next 1,000 or so year period, and spread out, and people will become varied. And it's speciation. Where have we seen that before? So that's the future of the Vorkosiverse. The aliens will be us.
Yeah, you can even imagine how then the different cultures would then also influence the biology, and that it really would be a cultural, I'm not sure how to put it, but it's not random. It's like also partly decided by each
Yeah.
culture, like where do they want to go?
Yeah, every culture will make its own choices, and choose what to enforce. We'll find that they can't enforce some things. People will squirt off and go to other places if they have different ideas. So it's a cat that is out of the bag. It is multiple cats that is out of multiple bags, actually, already in the Vorkosiverse. So what you get will be what you can pay for. And the other thing I explored with Ethan Avathos, with the all-male planet, is the other thing that is required for successful reproduction is that other 18 years, past, you get them out of the uterine replicator, where you still got to keep this kid alive, educate them, bring them up in your culture, make them willing to carry it on for the next generation. Otherwise, you don't have successful reproduction. It doesn't stop at birth. I've said that evolution is a blind machine with only one counting ratchet, and that is successful reproduction. And that doesn't mean number of offspring, it means number of offspring who survive to reproduce. That's the counting ratchet. If you're a frog, you can lay 1,000 eggs and let most of them go. If you're an elephant, you take one and you take very good care of it. Both of those are viable strategies. But if they don't result in offspring that can grow up and have more offspring, then it's an evolutionary dead end and it erases itself.
Yeah, and also like you said, if the culture doesn't continue, like if the offspring leaves and goes elsewhere, then it's also, or if they choose some different paths, then it's also.
And if the culture does not support taking care of kids, then that culture will also go down because they will not bring up adults who are capable of having more kids. It's the way it works. It's the arithmetic of evolution.
Yeah.
There are a couple. Oh,
it's not your personal happiness that evolution is trying to maximize. It's your offspring.
That's true. Yeah, Jeff, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was going to change the subject a little bit. Do you have anything else on this?
I have kind of tangentially related. I was thinking about this overall theme of like this gender, sexuality, this to explore different ways in that can be expressed and how it can work culturally. And it's the same here that for me, I came to this quite recently. So I don't know, it must have changed a lot, the I'm not sure how to put it, but like readers' reactions, for example, like from those who read the books when they first started to those who start reading them now. If you could tell something about that.
Yeah, there's different. If you hit Ethan of Athos in 1986, it would have seemed really cutting edge. I got letters from gay readers who were so pleased to have a positive portrayal of a gay protagonist in a science fiction novel. And now you have people who are all concerned about other social issues. It doesn't match what we think it ought to be now. It's because it's written in 1986. So there's an interesting problem with readers who do not know how to find copyright dates. If you walked into the Vorkosiverse last week and thought it was all written week before last, you're going to find it kind of confusing. And if you're a person who walked into it and read it last week and doesn't know anything about the 1980s or 1990s, which is now possible, you're going to get a different reading because you're, once again, each reader is bringing to that string of words stuff out of their head. So yeah, there's going to be some interesting misreadings as time goes on, as the context falls away and is forgotten, and the books have to stand through multiple generations of readers who bring such different things to them. And I just have to hope that there's enough core biology that is universal and ongoing that people will continue to relate to characters.
So if we're talking generations of readers, there's a couple of trends that I've noticed over the last, I guess, 40 years. Stories involving slavery, human slavery, are much less common, and sexual assault in sci-fi and fantasy seems much less common. Not altogether, obviously, the George R. R. Martin and so on, but you had one in Cordelia. Slavery, I guess, more around Jackson's Hole and all that stuff.
Well,
but
the
did you ever
colonies were
make
slaves. I mean, that whole story of falling
yes.
free was an escape from slavery.
But as you've gone on, it seems like a little bit less of that. Was that a conscious choice, or was that just how things shook out?
Well, plus, I don't like to repeat myself. If I've used a trope once, and using it 9 more times doesn't add anything to the story. And I think the other changes is not that there's more or less, for example, sexual assault. Is that now people complain about it. They didn't used to. It used to be fish in the sea. You just took it as part of the background. And this is a good thing, this progress. Yes, it should be complained about. Absolutely. But that doesn't mean there's a difference in the story between when you have something in a story, whether you are promulgating it or exploring it. There's a legitimate function of art to explore all kinds of horrible things. Doesn't mean you're trying to promote them. And if you reader gets confused about the presence of this thing is the same as supporting it, it's like you're not going to be able to read a whole lot of books because you will not understand what's going on.
Yeah, I find a lot of complaints come when a product or when a book or movie or whatever uses a trope but doesn't question it or ponder the implications. Like even when Cordelia was assaulted, it was a big deal. Like it was
not a trivial event, no.
Whereas some folks, I love Star Wars, but robots are slaves, and I feel like it's never addressed.
Well, AI is a whole nother question that I'm not qualified to comment on. At what point do machines become people? There's, Isaac Asimov was exploring that back in the 50s. It's a question somebody's going to answer.
Did you ever struggle with when you wrote the world building, what type of culture to portray? Because we have the barrier and the beta colony in the start, and we see their culture, but there's also the overall galactic culture. Did you have an idea of what that culture was, or was this something that grew over time?
It grew over time. It's just basically the universe has developed as I wrote it. I didn't have it all in my head at the beginning, but I did have the idea in the beginning that it would be varied, that it wasn't going to be a monoculture like Asimov's Federation or whatever he called it. Each planet would be its own petri dish, and we could explore different cultures, different ideas, different laws, different responses, and could compare and contrast. So I wanted it to be multiplex and complicated from the beginning.
Was there
and
any
it
place?
Is that, yeah.
Yeah, it is very much. Was there any place that you felt was more of the normal space that you were like, okay, this is where the readers will feel at home?
Well, I did have one story set on Earth, Brothers in Arms.
Oh, yes.
We did visit Earth. Miles saw about as much of Earth as any other tourist down for 2 weeks would. Not very much. So yeah, and Escobar, we've never been there, but it sounds pretty normal. There's other planets that haven't been explored much. Kaibu which has gone over the top with cryonics, nevertheless has a functioning, normal economy going on along with, or it couldn't survive. Even Jackson's Hole has to have a functional economy somewhere, or nobody would have anything to eat. So yeah, it's got a range, including a range of normal. We can have different kinds of normal.
Do you have anything else, Sophia?
No,
I'm
I don't think
completely out
so.
of prepared questions.
Yeah, I'm also out of them. We had a general question about the subversion of tropes. Did you
Mm-hmm.
ever consciously think like, oh, I'm gonna subvert this particular trope, or what was your
That comes up all
relationship
the
to trope?
it comes up all the time. Let's take this idea and flip it over and do something different with it. Ethan of Athos was a response to the Amazon planet tropes that were kicking around in the 60s. There were several books about what if a world was like all run by women, it's like sort of on the verge of women's liberation. It's like an anxiety response to write these stories. And I say, okay, let's flip it around, but let's give it real people with real children, because children create parents. What would happen if this culture was going to live more than one generation? They had to learn how to be good parents. And what happens 6 generations on? What does it look like? Yeah. So that was subverting a trope. It started with the science fiction trope and said, let's do the opposite. And so yeah, we've done that. Yeah, on small and large scales. That was probably the largest complete thought experiment. The Cetagandans, I'm not so much subverting the trope as exploring it. What happens when people try to make themselves be Supermen? Except that with Cetaganda, instead of most of the Superman ideas of our own disastrous history have been people deciding they already were the master race and going out to like spread their sperm everywhere. And this was like, okay, what if the women were in charge? What would happen? They would be gating in the gametes as choosily as possible. It would be a different structure. So let's explore that. What was a oocytic empire look like if you could have one? So that's what's going on at the core of Cetaganda. So yeah, taking a trope and shaking it upside down and saying, but what if you did something different is very fruitful idea source.
Is that why you didn't have the Gem Lords or whatever super fast or super strong super killers? Because the women want to perfect a single type of person?
Yeah. Unlike the other thing, the saving grace of the Cetagandan Star Crush is that they don't think they're finished yet. They think it's a work in progress. So they're not going to make multiple copies until they have a prototype they're satisfied with. And we're not there yet. They may never be there yet. We don't know. But yeah, the Gem Lords are basically drones. They are not.
Yeah.
They're samples. Okay, we will study this one, and then we will do something better next time. They are kind of disposable from the hot lady's point of view. So they're not going to turn them into something that could take out the Star Crash. They want to make sure that they stay in charge. So they keep all the really interesting bioweapons to themselves. And that was a thing. Oh yeah, bioweapons. You talked about various weapons that obvious mechanical weapons that, in the Vorgame. But the really scary weapon development is going on with the Cetagandans and others with bioweapons. And I touched on that in Gentleman Joel and the Red Queen very explicitly. And I think a lot of people blipped over it. It was a scene where they're all aboard the Prince Serg, and Joel and Cordelia and Miles are all, and Andy Catterin are all talking about these issues and what they found when they opened up the Cetagandan bunker and all that material that they had stashed, and the things they found about what the Cetagandan Gemjanto had been actually planning to do to Barrier. And it's like, yeah, okay, what are we doing to defend against this kind of attack? And Joel said, you really can't talk too much about this because it's all classified. Miles thinks about, he remembers being an IMSEC and the analyst section that worked on these kinds of problems was called the Nightmare Barn. Everybody in it looked really stressed. And then in that same book, we have Admiral Joel deciding to retire from his military post and become a biologist. And that is not because he is abandoning the defensive barrier. It's because he's switching over to where it's going to matter more. And even if he isn't going to be a hotshot young scientist, he can at least train the next generation of them who will be having to solve these problems. So he has not really abandoned his core ideal of service. He's just figured out where to shift it so that it's more useful, important.
That's interesting. And it could also be an evolution of Barrier and its planet system, that they are going away from this. I guess it becomes more subtle kind of warfare when you're looking into like the biology, and you can't really just look at like, where can we shoot this stunner or this nerve receptor? Yeah, could be both, but just this.
But once that cat's out of the bag, you have to think about it. So there's that. There's another little bit that occurred to me later. This is getting down to the details of the story. We're not talking more generally. We have the hot Moira, Ivan's mother-in-law, the hot grandmother. And there's a bit where she finds, when they undo the bunker, she finds their old gene bank, the Barrier and gene bank. And she takes it and she offers to sell it to the Star Crush, and instead she blows it up in front of them. As kind of screw you to her former colleagues. And in the story, it is presented as her revenge for having been ejected from the Hot, of having been sent off to be a gem wife. But it occurs to me also that what she is doing is blowing up a whole bunch of material that the Star Crush could have used to make Barrier and keyed bioweapons, and is taking that away from them. So it's like she's making a declaration that she's actually on the side of her new son-in-law. And
that right there is
that I
the
don't think
holy
anybody
grail.
Connected.
Oh, that type of weapon is the holy grail of intelligence services all over the world. The ability to kill a particular person based on their genetic, phenotype or whatever.
Yep. So, she took away from the Star Crush some of their ability to do that, and I think was intentional on her part. She is definitely no longer a seed again, and at that point.
That's great. I love when you have stepped away from a book, like it's done, whatever, and you go back and you realize things like that, like that you didn't consciously consider, but it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, that was a late connection. Now, what Joel did, I was thinking about at the time, that was deliberate, but I didn't spell it out. So a whole lot of people, did not make that connection. So that's okay. Some will.
Yeah. Wow. You had mentioned you had more than one question for us. Do you have any idea what that was?
I think we've done pretty well. I think you're going to have to cut this interview in half and put it up in two parts. Yeah. Or maybe 3. Fine.
Heck yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I had a great time. I assume Sophia did.
Yeah, I had a good time.
It's a fun conversation.
Yeah. One thing we like to do is recommendations, and then we'll let you go. Do you have anything that you're reading or watching, listening to, that you think somebody should get into?
For the last couple of years, I've fallen into Asian streaming media, which is also something that did not exist earlier in my life. So I've been watching anime for years, manga occasionally, and now more live action Chinese and other television dramas. First one I watched was The Untamed, which was being thrown in at the deep end. And then several others since then. I'm sort of getting the context of what is called Xanxia genre, Xianxia, and it is basically Chinese escapist fantasy, which works just as well as any other escapist fantasy for escape. Plus, you learn about a new culture while you're at it. So that's been pretty cool. The Untamed, Hotel Del Luna is a Korean show, live action, very good fantasy. And as far as anime goes, there's a ton of it. Mushishi has always been my favorite. I review manga that I read on my Goodreads blog. If you go to my Goodreads blog and look up Lois's book reviews, you can find them all. And occasionally touch on shows. So a lot of that.
That's fantastic. Speaking of Chinese fantasy, have you read Jin Yang's A Hero Born or Legend of the Condor Heroes?
No, not yet. I'm just scratching the surface of that. I've only read a few so far.
It's my favorite fantasy series. It's gorgeous. It's from the 60s, but it feels so, I don't know, eternally relevant, like Shakespeare or something. I highly recommend it.
Yep.
Let's see. Sophia, do you have any recommendations?
The only thing I can think of is that I was watching Fallout season 1, but I feel like it's very late for
so
that.
good.
Everybody's been like, "Oh, it's really good," and I'm like, "Yes, I agree."
It's amazing. I also highly recommend that series. One of the few shows that I can go back and rewatch and enjoy every episode. You know, most things, like even your favorite album might have a song that's terrible or whatever. Like, it seemed to avoid that fate. Yeah, I just want to shout out The Doctor's Watcher. This podcast, every 2 weeks, they cover an episode of Doctor Who. And if you remember in the 60s, every serial, what we would think of an episode, was broken into these different episodes. And so they're just finally finishing, after 5 years, the first Doctor. And they're switching co-hosts. So it's a good time if you're a fan of the second Doctor, or if you just want to try out a podcast and see what it's like, to either jump in there or go back to the beginning. All of classic Doctor Who is on BritBox, so if you want to find out what that's all about, go over there. But yeah, Kyle and Benny, they made a fantastic podcast. I was there listening from the beginning, and so it's always hard to say goodbye to a podcaster. Like, I've said goodbye to so many over the last 10 years. Or when your favorite podcast shuts down and like is no longer current. That's always a weird feeling. I don't know. How do you deal with letting go of things, Lois?
It takes care of itself. Used to be you had to do it all the time, because when Star Trek went off in 1968 or whenever, it was the last I was ever going to see it, because there was no such thing as video recording, and I had no idea it would surface so much again. So yeah, it's a thing. I was thinking about Doctor Who. The first I had heard of it was there was a British exchange grad student in that old science fiction club back in the late 60s. I remember him trying to tell me about Doctor Who, and it was just kind of incomprehensible. Yeah, but he was really enthusiastic about it. I did not actually see any of the shows until the mid 80s when I caught some of the Tom Baker on PBS. That is my total acquaintance with Doctor Who. But I can remember him trying to explain it and me totally not getting it.
It's a pretty wild concept.
Okay.
I guess that's it. Sophia, you have any other things you need?
No, I don't think so.
We can do our plugs and stuff later, but thank you so much, Lois, for joining us. And I continue to tell everyone I know to check out your books, and
Try the Penrick novellas if you haven't tried them yet.
Yeah.
Penrick's Demon is the one to start with. It's all on ebooks.
Good deal. All righty. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, listener, for sticking with us through 3 hours of scintillating content. Until the next time, Lois, have a wonderful week. And we'll see you all next time here on The Great and Secret Knowledge.
Take care.
Bye.
A huge thanks to James Lark of jameslark.co.uk for providing our wonderful theme song. Thank you, James.